This time, as we talk about ethical hacking and securing technologies, people, and processes, let's look at Metasploit. Metasploit, we've talked about Nmap, and we've talked about doing basic recon, everything from Wiz, and doing various kinds of lookups to figure out what the target is and how rich the target is. Look at the Nmap to as if see which doors are open, what you can find out about what kind of structure it is. Then it's time to send the payload, and that's Metasploit, from recon to payload. So again, remember, tempered curiosity is key. Understand the logic and don't be a script jockey. Just don't get scripts. They might end up tampering your own machine rather than anybody else, and use a sandbox all the time. So Metasploit is an open source framework, a set of tools for information gathering, scanning, exploitation, exploit development, post-exploitation. So everything from you gathering information, scanning, exploitation, but then you're also doing how do you develop the exploit, especially when you hear about things such as persistent threats. So persistent threats not only exploit, but they develop their exploits over time. And then what do you do post-exploitation? Once you've exploited something, you've either exfiltrated something, disrupted something, encrypted something, what do you do after that? How do you remove your footprints so that you're likely not to get diagnosed or caught? This is of course used heavily for pen testing, penetration testing, both by blue teams and red teams. Main components of a Metasploit framework are as follows. There's the MSF console, which is the main command line interface. You can access it by typing MSF console on your TryHackMe or any other site, or if you've got a sandbox running with Parrot and so forth, you can always run that. Then you've got a variety of modules. These are exploits, scanners, payloads. We'll talk about what each of these do, right? So that's what we're going to do. What's an exploit? An exploit is basically a piece of code that uses a vulnerability present on a target system. I'd say that's all it does. It tries to use, or exploit, as the name suggests, a vulnerability on the target system. What is a vulnerability? It's a design, coding, or logic flaw affecting the target system. Whether you're talking about a process flaw, which is how data moves from one part to another, one piece to another, where how a variable moves, it can be hijacked, tampered with, something else can happen. Exploitation of a vulnerability can result in disclosing confidential information or allowing the hacker to execute code on the target system. Next is auxiliary. It's a module that's not an exploit. Auxiliary modules are used for purposes other than exploitation. They can perform actions that may not be directly related to exploitation. They can include scanners, fuzzers, denial of service attacks, right? So module basically is an exploit only if it executes a payload. If it doesn't execute a payload, so you're not dropping anything, you might just deny service, you might scan something, you might fuzz the system, then it's just an auxiliary. But the minute you execute a payload, it becomes an exploit. Very important to realize that. Then of course is a payload. What exactly is a payload? A payload in an exploit takes advantage of a vulnerability, but if we want the exploit to have a result we want, which is gaining access, read confidential information, encrypt something, we need to use a payload. Payload is basically the code that will run on the target systems. There are multiple different types of payloads. One are singles. Singles are self-contained payloads, such as add user, lodge notepad exe, start a keylogger, something that does not need to download an additional component to run. So, of course, if you're running keylogger, you might have to, but assume you've already infiltrated that. So something that's already system-based, so don't worry about the keylogger. It would require you to have a keylogger in there. So the singles would be something that the system already has that you're just triggering. Adapters, on the other hand, wrap a payload inside a specific type of format. think of it as a vehicle, right? Planes, trains, automobiles, meant to pass through and be used or executed effectively inside a checkpoint, such as a PowerShell, right? So you are now wrapping, a payload inside a specific format and then starting that. Then of course you've got stages. Stages set up the connection channel between Metasploit and the target system. So it creates this connection channel. Oftentimes you see that with C2C. It's useful when working with stage payloads. Stage payloads will first upload a stage on the target system, then download the rest of the payload in stages. This would be things such as, whether you're downloading a keylogger or whatever else you might be downloading, right? Some kind of constant feedback, something to constantly morph and remorph. So small footprint to enter, and then use it to download a larger malware payload like a command and control setup. So an inline single is a payload prefaced by the specific type, ping, and then generic shell reverse TCP when a stage payload is under a directory folder, right? So an inline is what occurs, with a preface, right? In this case, it's a payload prefaced by the specific type. What is the type? It's typically an ICMP ping, right? And while a stage payload is under a directory, say you've got a stage payload under a directory and now you're starting a ping, right? So see, it's under Windows x64 architecture, shell, it's a reverse TCP, and now you're starting a shell reverse TCP. So once again, exploits when used after recon and vulnerability assessment when a specific payload has been identified in a target system or application. What's the purpose? The purpose is to leverage vulnerabilities in software or systems to gain unauthorized access or execute arbitrary code. Exploits are tools that take advantage of these security weaknesses. It allows the attacker to compromise the system. Auxiliary, we talked about it. All phases of penetration testing, from initial recon to vulnerability identification and even post-exploitation. They can be fuzzers, again, scanners, sniffers, but they can't be using a payload, then it becomes an exploit. And then of course, post-exploitation. When do you use it? After successfully compromising a system or a network. What's the purpose? To assess the depth of control, right? Gather further information, escalate privileges, maintain access, exploit the network further. So post-exploitation modules can do everything from hiding your footprints to escalating privileges, downloading more stuff through a CNC, exfiltrating data, encrypting data, performing various different actions based on the hacker's objectives. What are payloads? They're used in conjunction with exploits, and they're code that's executed on the target system upon successful exploitation. They define what it will achieve, such as opening a shell or establishing a meter preter session, which basically allows you to control the compromised system. And then comes encoders. When do you use them? When you're generating payloads that need to evade detection or bypass input filtering mechanisms. And then what encoders do is they transform payload code into a format that can avoid. So you're trying to bypass security devices like IDSs and IPSs, antiviruses, or bypass input sanitization checks, right? So input sanitization cleans up, make sure that you're parameterizing the inputs and the variables so that you can't run code directly. So they'll sanitize the inputs, but they try to bypass that. Then ensure that the payload reaches and executes on the target without being stopped or altered. Then of course you've got something called NOPS, or no operation. When do you use that? Mainly when you're doing buffer overflow exploits or when precise payload size is critical. So you're trying to fill in space in an exploit payload. all you're doing is trying to fool by the system by ensuring that the payload's memory structure aligns correctly without affecting the execution flow. And that will make the system, it'll think it's something okay. So you're trying to fill that in. No operation. The system itself, the whole idea is it's very much like judo. You're using the system's own deficiencies to feed it things that it's going to overwhelm itself, and then of course you've got something like a buffer overflow. And then evasion, when throughout the penetration testing process, especially during exploitation and post-exploitation, what's the purpose? Employed to avoid detection by security solutions, bypass security controls, and maintain access without alerting the system's administrations. This includes techniques to modify, exploit payroll signatures, hide malicious traffic, or manipulate system features to avoid detection. So you try to hide yourself in a very, very clever way, right? So they're never being detected, even after you've entered the system. So there are different types of exploits, here's some use cases. Let's go through them. There's a Net API exploit. Of course, you see a lot of them are Windows exploits, some of them are Unix exploits, and so forth. So this is a Windows SMB exploit, and it's called Net API. It targets a vulnerability in Windows Server Service, famous for allowing remote code execution in older Windows versions. So once remember with an Nmap, if you can figure out what the OS is, if you know that there are somebody who's running an old system, then you know that you could actually use something like Net API as an exploit, and they can lead to widespread worms like configure. Why and when? Critical for testing systems still running these legacy Windows versions to ensure they're patched against this well-known vulnerability. Similarly, from a Unix standpoint, for a web app, there's something called WP admin shell, and this is of course WordPress WP. Exploits vulnerabilities in WordPress plugins or themes to upload a malicious shell, and that's why WordPress sites are sometimes dangerous. Why and when? Used for penetration testers assessing WordPress sites for plugin theme vulnerabilities for unauthorized access issues. Then auxiliary. Here's an auxiliary example. It's again an auxiliary scanner, secure shell, doesn't log in, attempts to log in by a secure shell using provided credentials, useful for testing the strength of secure shell passwords and weak credentials. Again, SMB psexec command executes commands on Windows machines using an SMB psexec. You see that SMB is a big issue given appropriate credentials. Why and when? It's valuable for post-exploitation to run commands remotely on a compromised Windows host. Then comes auxiliary, but in this case you're gathering and enumerating the DNS. So in this case, of course, you're enumerating the DNS from a target domain. Why and when? Crucial for gathering intelligence about target domains, identifying potential targets for further exploitation or phishing campaigns, right? So it tells you all about the DNS. Then something called post. What does it do? Again, on a Windows machine. So remember, it's get and post, right? Asking and you're fetching, right? So asking, fetching, and getting, right? So this is an RDP enablement going on. So enables remote desktop protocol, which is RTP, on a compromised Windows host. Why and when? Useful for maintaining access or facilitating direct interaction with a compromised system. Now, then of course you've got something like Chrome cookies. So this is browser specific posting. Gathers cookies from Chrome browsers. Why and when? Valuable for stealing sessions or session information, or impersonating users, especially after gaining access to a user's systems or a user system. Then comes payloads. Example, there's a meterpreter on a Windows, and meterpreter again, remember, it's something where it allows you can run a command and you can take control of the machine. Part of Metasploit, reverse TCP. It now opens a reverse TCP connection from the target to the attacker. providing a meter-breeder session. So you're now creating a backward channel that the target doesn't know about. Fundamental for maintaining control over compromised Windows host, allowing deep interaction and control. Then on the other hand, on the Unix, you've got something like reverse Python, where it uses Python to establish a reverse shell. It's handy when the target system has Python installed, allowing for a simple and effective reverse shell. So you can get a simple and effective reverse shell from there. Again, these are different types of payloads. And of course, encoders. Here's an encoder called Shikata or Shikata Ganai. Encodes payloads to avoid signature-based detection. So it's again trying to bypass the system. Highly versatile and effective for evading antivirus solutions, making a go-to choice for obfuscating payloads in which you're hiding your payloads. Then there's a PHP base 64. So it encodes PHP payloads in base 64, which is great for web application exploits. It's ideal for evading detection mechanisms in web applications by obfuscating the malicious PHP code. Then there's something called NOPS. Okay, we talked about that. There's no real operation going on, which is called an x86 single byte. So what this does is, again, we talked about buffer overflows and so forth, fills the payload space with single byte NOP operations, ensuring the payload size meets certain requirements without affecting execution. Crucial for maintaining payload size while avoiding payload corruption and somebody checking for integrity. So especially for buffer overflow exploits. Evasion, and then of course you've got things such as Windows Defender exclusion, adds exclusions to the Windows Defender, allowing malicious files to be executed. So what you're doing is you're as if creating a whitelist of dangerous things, saying, no, that's all right, that looks all right, that's all right, but that's actually Metasploit doing that to evade the setup. So it's vital for maintaining persistence on a compromised Windows host without triggering antivirus alerts. So once again, Metasploit environment is typically, you start it off with your MSF console. You send a single ping, for example, in this case, to a Google DNS, and ping -c, and then 8888. Remember, WannaCry used the infamous Windows Eternal Blue exploit, originally developed by NSA, National Security Administration in the US, to hack into SMB, server message block servers, to take control of client systems. So in this case, now you can say use. What are you using? Use exploit /Windows/SMB MS17010 Eternal Blue. So once you say what kind of exploit you want, it'll tell you all the exploits you can have related to a certain system or a certain vulnerability, right? So it should say that the exploit is there, but a payload is missing, and move you to the directory. Then it suddenly says MSF6 exploit. If you look at it, now says it's Windows SMB MS17010 Eternal Blue. So Eternal Blue is the exploit. Show all the categories. It now will give you all the categories. You can now say show options. Now it will show these required things like rhost and optional parameters to launch the attack. Pay attention to the target and payload options. So MSF exploit, you're still within that folder. Show payloads, show modules. Now try a useful function called check. So let's assign rhost, set rhost IP, run check. Correct check on, this is a way to check on whether the target vulnerability is truly there for the exploit to work, right? So info to gain information on a specific. So now see, you say host is likely vulnerable. So if you're looking at this, see, host is likely vulnerable, and then scan the host, the target is vulnerable, right? So once you run the check and you set the rhost to a certain IP address. Another example process, Metasploit allows you to search with specifics. Search type, exploit, platform, Windows. What are we doing? We're searching the type. Type would be exploit. What is the platform? The platform is Windows, right? So what type? Exploit. What platform? Windows. Or you could do search secure shell, use 50, whatever the number is. So each of them have different numbers, right? Different types of exploits. Show options, set rhosts, right? Or set grhosts. So, and then username Molly, password from word list, which basically stores all these passwords, and then set verbose true, so you're going to get as much information as you can. Exploit, once you find the password, you can now use secure shell to log in. So say you can run this whole set. And so remember, word lists are compiled passwords and usernames purchased or downloaded from breach sites. For example, from the dark web, the exploit tries to match all passwords to the username. So oftentimes, you'd use things like lhost to specify your attacker machine IP for reverse shells and to establish a connection. Hope that was useful. Thank you very much and see you again. Bye.